I really enjoy the interaction here at the Tugboat Group. As Dave alluded to, I'm probably one of the older guys here, and I get an awful lot of energy from seeing a lot of the young entrepreneurs and the things that you are dealing with. And Dave asked me to talk about boards, and I want to talk about boards a little bit by telling the Ritter story. I'd like to talk a little bit about how our businesses have evolved, how our management has evolved, how our ownership has evolved, and how that has impacted our board structure, and in some cases vice versa. I'm also going to share with you, if you're thinking about starting a board, what are some of the questions that you should ask yourself, and then provide some practical ideas about how you might go about creating and operating a highly engaged, high-performing board that can really help your Evergreen company's future. For the last 5.5 years, I have been privileged to work with Ritter Company. And as Dave mentioned, we have sort of beat the odds, I think primarily because we have entered, grown, and exited businesses opportunistically. Over that history, our board has evolved as well. And really over the last 20 years, we've really adopted the philosophy that our board structure is critical to the success of keeping Ritter Company a family-owned business. First, a little bit of, whoops. Okay, a little bit of our history. It all started in 1886 when our founder, Ernest Ritter, left his home in Iowa and went to Mark Tree, Arkansas to go to work in his uncle's sawmill. At the age of 20, which, he's pretty young at the age of 21. And Mark Tree, Arkansas is in the Mississippi River Valley, the Delta. Today, it's predominantly some of the most productive farmland, millions upon millions of acres. But back at that time, it was a undeveloped hardwood bottomland forest, millions upon millions of acres. And there were a lot of people, companies and people moving into that area to cut the timber, process it into lumber and veneer to meet the needs of the nation for housing, furniture, boxes, and so forth. So he got there and he saw an opportunity, and he built and started a general store to serve the area. As the community grew and prospered, he saw other opportunities, and his entrepreneurial spirit kicked in. So what he started doing was, a few years afterwards, he started buying some of that cut-over timberland and clearing it for farms for himself, and he sold it to others. He also built houses. He also founded the electric company in Mark Tree, Arkansas to serve the area. And he also built an ice house to serve trains that were bringing fresh produce from the West Coast to the East Coast. They'd stop along the way and take on ice. And he also built a cotton gin to process the cotton in that area. Our first entry into the communications industry was in 1906 when Ernest Ritter founded Ritter Telephone Company. That was pretty rare for that time for a community of that size and in that location to have phone service. But he was quite the visionary and the entrepreneur, and this was our platform company for Ritter Communications. So Ernest Ritter died really at a young age in 56, at 56, and the next 3 generations of his descendants who ran the company grew the farming and the communications businesses quite substantially. They were also very entrepreneurial as well, and they got in and out of several businesses along the way. At one point, we operated sawmills in a lumber yard. We had dealerships, both auto dealerships and farm equipment dealerships. At one time, we were in the concrete business. We were deeply ingrained in the agricultural business, and we had a business called Ritter Crop Services, and which is a farm inputs distributor. We would sell in the spring seed, fertilizer, pesticide to the farmers, and at the end of the year, at the harvest, Our Ritter Grain Services would buy the harvest, buy the grain, store it, and merchandise the thing. So 131 years later, Ritter Company remains a family-owned business, and we have over 50 shareholders. Today, we operate in two segments. We operate in the ag side. We own about 50,000 acres of farmland, and we also provide farm management services to other landowners in the area. Our communications division is broken down into two subdivisions. Our residential division serves 69 small communities in Tennessee and Arkansas, providing high-speed internet, cable TV, and voice services. Our enterprise and wholesale division is our growth vehicle there in communications. We have built and acquired a fiber optic network throughout Arkansas. We serve about 150 cell towers, Verizon, T-Mobile, and Sprint. We also offer state-of-the-art, custom-tailored telecommunication services to businesses of all sizes as well. So as we start talking about boards, the good news as a private company is that you have a lot of flexibility in how you might design and structure your board. That's not the case with public companies who have a lot of strict requirements that are put in place by the SEC and the exchanges. So really there are two types of boards. There's an advisory board is more flexible, it's less formal, and that board will provide non-binding advice to the CEO and the management team. You also have fiduciary boards, which are a little more formal. The shareholders will elect the directors of a fiduciary board. And the fiduciary board, the members actually have some authority to make certain decisions. A lot of times, companies that are adopting boards for the first time will go with an advisory board as a safe first step, and it kind of helps assuage the fear of many owners of losing control. But the effectiveness of a board is not dictated by its structure and its type. The effectiveness of a board is really more about how it's composed and how that board interacts with the management team. So there's a great article in Harvard Business Review, I think back in 2004, by David Nadler, and he got into talking about describing and classifying boards and certain models of boards based upon their level of engagement. The first level and the lowest level engagement that he described was the passive board. A passive board is typically the CEO and some key managers, or it could be CEOs and some cronies. Typically, there's not a lot of challenging of the CEO in the board meetings, and really these boards ratify management decisions. A higher level of engagement, described by David Nadler, is the certifying board. A certifying board will have some independent board members represented, and their focus is to provide some credibility to the to stockholders that may not be in management, that the management team is subject to some accountability and some oversight, and that they're doing a good job. The next level of engagement or of involvement, David Nadler described as the engaged board. This is a board that really functions as a partner to the CEO and the management team. These types of boards, have deep discussions about key issues, strategy, risk, and so forth. They offer insight, advice, and there's a much higher participation level. This is what a lot of people will call the noses in, fingers out level, is an engaged board. Now, from time to time, companies might find themselves in a crisis. I think Uber might have found itself in a bit of a crisis here recently, and a lot of the banks back in the back in the late 2000s due to the financial troubles, and they then go into what they call the intervening level. The intervening level is a crisis model where the board steps in and starts making a lot of the decisions. And then finally, there is the, David Nadler described the operating model. The operating model is one where the board makes probably most of the decisions that management implements. Typically, you'll find an operating board is a good board for companies that the senior management might not have a whole lot of management experience. Next. So it's my view that the engaged board is the sweet spot. I like the engaged board because its purpose is aspirational. It's beyond compliance. It's dealing with, its focus is on sustaining the success of the organization as well as the success of the management team. So boards will evolve over time. And I think the Ritter Board is a great illustration of that. You know, in the first 60 years of our history, our board, the ownership and the management was about the same. There were very few people that owned the company that were not part of management. So the board structure was pretty much the family management and some other key outside members, and the level of engagement was pretty passive. We have never found any minutes from those board meetings. Later on, you know, and again, the ownership has always been in the family, and really for the first 120 years, the leadership the senior leadership was the family itself. It wasn't until the last 10 years that non-family members like myself and others have gotten involved and have taken on the leadership roles. So in the mid-60s, the family, as it was growing, and some of them were moving away from the area, and the number of family members that were in senior management started to diminish, the family adopted what they call a branch representation model, where there were 3 branches at the time, and each branch could put 2 members on the board. Well, as it continued as it continued on, the family said, well, let's start bringing in some independent board members to provide some outside advice and guidance. First 1, and then 10 years later, there were 2. It wasn't until about 2009 that the family decided that they felt like they were ready to have a majority independent model. And so in 2009, the family decided that they wanted to have 5 independent board members and 4 family board members. They also developed some very strict criteria about what types of skills and that they wanted represented on that board by both, and what the personal characteristics should be for both the family members as well as the independent board members. We've been very intentional over the last several years to create a board that's really well aligned with the businesses that we're in and what we see as the future needs. Today, the 5 independent board members, we have 1 who's a family business expert. He sits on a lot of family business boards, and he also does a lot of family business consulting. We have 2 members of the board that have telecommunications experience. One's a CEO of a company very similar to ours in another geographical area, non-competitor, and another is a former senior executive of Time Warner Cable. We also have a former CEO of an agribusiness consulting company, and we have a former COO of an investment advisory company. So as you can see from the Ritter illustration, boards will evolve over time, and it does take time. Really, building a board and getting it functioning at a high level, it's more of a marathon, it's not a sprint. So if you're going to get started, what are some of the key questions you need to ask yourself? The first question you need to ask is, are we ready? And when I talk about we, I'm talking on one hand, the company. Does the company have a clear, well-articulated strategy that's in place with goals and milestones? And does it have a management team in place that's aligned with those goals? If that's not the case, you probably ought to focus on that first before you start dealing with a board. The next thing you need to focus on is ask yourself, who are my stakeholders now, and who might be my stakeholders in the future, and what are their needs? The stakeholder needs of a startup company that's 100% owned and run by an entrepreneur is far different than from a multi-generation business that is, has stockholders both inside and outside of management. So the answers to the first two questions really kind of drive what type of structure you want, whether you want an advisory board or a fiduciary board, and also the composition between management members, independent board members, and key stockholders. Next two questions you want to ask is, where are we going? Where we want to be in 5 to 10 years? And where are we now? Are there certain skill sets that are needed that we don't have? Are there gaps in our skills? For instance, if you're really good at product innovation and technology, and to achieve your goals for your company is going to require some branding and marketing, and that's not your skill set, you may have identified a gap right there that you may want to fill with your board. So once you've decided to, how do you go about building your board? It's really good if you could get some members on your board that can meet what I call the been there and done that test. People who understand strategy, who understand the challenges CEOs face and organizations face. People that have that been there and done that criteria are CEOs and former CEOs. Also, senior leaders in larger businesses in certain functions that you need are also great board members. It's also really important to get people that have diverse perspectives, who don't think like you do, so that you can avoid the groupthink mentality, and also people who collaborate well and are good team players. Really, if you think about all these criteria and you put it all together, you're looking for people who can be mentors to you and to your management team. Good, effective boards establish a rhythm of meeting periodically on a steady basis. And it's important to have agendas and materials prepared in advance. These agendas really need to deal with big picture topics. You really shouldn't be spending your board meetings talking about cost variances and things like that in a certain division of your company. You want to be talking about strategy, risks, competition, opportunities, threats, and so forth. And you really want to spend your time in discussion. We have a thing on the top of all of our agendas that the board meeting begins where the materials end. We expect our directors to have read the material and come prepared to discuss and have their questions. What you want to avoid doing is have what I call the death by PowerPoint, where the majority of the time is spent talking about explaining to the board members what the situation is. You want the majority of the time involved in, where they're in discussion. Compensation, if you're going to have a board that has peers of yours and that are better, more experienced than you, you need to compensate them. But you also have to understand that board members, the reason that they will join your board, it's really not about the money. They will join your board primarily because they really like your mission, vision, values, they like your strategy, and they feel some level of affinity with the team. But, they're not going to do it for nothing, especially if you're going to ask them to invest the time to get to know the business so that they can have an impact. So typically, a rule of thumb that I've heard for is that you should compensate outside board members based upon what your hourly rate is. And you typically do that in the form of annual retainers and meeting fees. And sometimes you do it in terms of cash or equity. So final thoughts, I'm sorry I ran over. Building a board is like building a management team. It's about getting the right people on your board with the right mindset and with a well-defined purpose and role. And from our standpoint, if you're going to make this investment in time, you should do it to get to an aspirational purpose as someone that can help propel you and help your Evergreen company have a better future. Thank you.